Rice, the most famous man you've never heard of. Author David Carlian discusses the life and times of Mr. Rice, a well-known entertainer and humorist in America in the 19th century. This event is an hour.
Good evening and welcome to the Larchmont Library. I'm Nancy Donovan, representing the library, and we're pleased to have you here this evening to get to know David Carlian, our author for the evening. David is a local resident. He lives in Larchmont, and there's some interesting things about his past. David graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, from the law school there, but at the same time, he decided to go to Clown College, Ringling Brothers Clown College. So he went off to Clown College, even though he was just about to pass the bar. He had taken the bar exam and was waiting for the results. So he spent 3 years with Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus as one of their clowns. And then he went on, came on here to New York City and worked in the theater here in New York for a few years, and went off to Northwestern, where he got a PhD in theater. We're pleased to have David, who is the author of Dan Rice, the most famous man you never heard of, and we know you'll enjoy hearing from David. David Carlian.
Thank you, Nancy. Good evening. Thank you for coming on a rainy evening. 150 years ago, somebody making their way up the Boston Post Road from New York to New Haven and on to Boston, just a few steps from the library right here, might have stopped. When they stopped, they're chatting with say, a local resident. And if somebody mentioned Dan Rice, whoever that traveler was, they would know exactly who it was. They would pass around one of his jokes. They may sing a snatch or two of one of his songs. That's 150 years ago. 100 years ago, about the time Dan Rice died and Larchmont was becoming a burgeoning summer film community, there would be a few of those theater and film veterans here in Larchmont who would have remembered the name, but everybody else, totally a blank. And 50 years ago here, nobody. And tonight, 150 years later, let's see if I can do something about that. I wrote the book with 3 questions in mind. Who's Dan Rice? Why was he famous? Why did he fall from fame? Dan Rice, to begin with, was, the answers to those questions are not trivial moments for historians. They have to do with our American past, with how we formed as a country through the 19th century. Dan Rice was in the middle of that, in the same way that we see Shakespeare not only in direct quotations in other writers, but in almost the genetic code of writing, of the way we look at writing. Similarly, Dan Rice is a part of our American culture. Unlike Shakespeare, though, people know who he is and they see those quotations, they see those influences. Dan Rice, less so, and we'll talk about that tonight. By job description, Dan Rice was a clown in a circus, but I must immediately stop, take a step back, and explain that those mean very different things now than they used to. A circus was not what it is now. A juvenile entertainment, a place to take kids, a kind of way to pass the time when you're looking for a little bit of pleasure on an evening. Circus was a place of pleasure, but it was an adult entertainment. It was a place where a talking clown like Dan Rice would stand up there and talk about passing currents, talk about politics, talk about what women were wearing. He, at one point, talked about his preference for the latest fashion in women's clothes. He called it the Lo and Behold style. it was the American circus in the 1850s, 1860s was a place of sex and violence. Dan Rice, in the middle of that, stood there in the ring talking about whatever came to mind, whatever was on people's minds, and in the process became a public figure, not simply famous, but known throughout the country for his opinions. In our age, he might become one of the talking heads on one of the radio shows, one of the television shows. And then from that, he became a political candidate. Later ages would diminish that and say he was just doing it for publicity. They were legitimate campaigns for office, and he did them from the circus ring. He stood in the circus ring and ran for the Pennsylvania State Senate, then for Congress, and then for president. To give you some kind of cultural references, he palled around with Stephen Foster. He claimed connection with the Mormon Joseph Smith in Joseph Smith's early days on the Western frontier. That one was not true. Rice made many claims, but there was a slight connection in that he did dine with Smith's widow after Joseph Smith was lynched by anti-Mormon mobs. Dan Rice was reviewed by Walt Whitman favorably. He competed against P.T. Barnum. He feuded with the famous New York Tribune editor, Horace Greeley, and most people said he came off better in the deal. His influences continue. Dan Rice toured with Dan Rice's Great Show before Barnum and Bailey used the phrase, the greatest show on earth. Barnum and Bailey's press agent at the time was Rice's cousin, who had been Rice's press agent. He was the great American humorist when he toured America's rivers and roads, including stops in Hannibal, Missouri, where a young Sam Clemens lived. A few years later, that Sam Clemens, as Mark Twain, would write Huckleberry Finn, in which a circus fits right into the middle of the book, discussing a circus clown. Twain also toured later as the American humorist, borrowing Rice's title. And then, now this is a tough one. The traditional take on Dan Rice is that he was the model for Uncle Sam. That's not exactly so, because Uncle Sam was an icon that was growing in various versions over 50, 60, 70 years. On the other hand, if you're talking about somebody who dressed in stars and stripes, who had a goatee, wore a top hat, if you're talking about somebody who knew the whole country and was known by the whole country, it's Dan Rice. And then just to kind of, I wish with my slides I could do what they could do in film and sort of blend into each other. If we go back here. Now this is Dan Rice at his spunkiest. But it's also what he would look like in the ring at times. Sometimes he would dress in the costume we expect of a 19th century clown. The stars, the stripes, the top hat. But whoops, wrong way. But sometimes in evening wear, in what a proper middle-class gentleman would wear. Still as a clown in the circus ring. He would alternate. He would do it differently depending on the audience, upon the town, how he was feeling that day, whether he was running for office or not. But now imagine this suit with stripes, and you've got the Uncle Sam icon. So that's a brief version of the who of Dan Rice. But why was he famous? I suppose the first thing that I have to say is his talent. He was incredibly smart. He was a very funny man. He had gone through an apprenticeship dancing and singing in the stables. America was a dancing, singing kind of place. Stephen Foster's biographers talk about how the Foster family in Pittsburgh, who were growing up with Dan Rice as a young man, would serenade each other. They'd gather in the parlor and sing. They'd go out on the town carousing and sing. They'd go to a woman's house and sing under her window. They were singing and dancing. That was Dan Rice. Then he went out with a learned pig. He had a trained pig. Now, I don't want to give away too many trade secrets. Pigs can't do too many things. However, if you frame it right, if you suggest what the pig is doing, then suddenly those few things a pig can do, grunt, paw, walk, amble, become a whole universe of things. So that the same pig doing exactly the same thing, pawing on the ground, can be adding. So, Sybil, can you add to 3? I'm sorry, 3 plus 2. And so he would signal the pig, it would paw 5 times, and it's a mathematical genius. If you put down a Y or an N and say, is this the smartest audience you've had this season? It always pays to flatter the audience. The pig would go over and paw on the Y, depending on how Rice signaled it. Then he became a songman, and then in 1843, his first circus. He was a comic singer and then a clown. I mentioned earlier that circus is very different now than it was then. Clown is very different. Clown was being defined at the time. It was still not quite clear what clown meant, because there were the silent clowns, there were knockabout clowns who did what we would now consider acrobatic clowning. There were talking clowns, like Rice, who sometimes specialized in Shakespeare. They would be Shakespearean clowns. Now that could range the gamut from a kind of bastardized quotation to a whole soliloquy. Rice had a 104-line rhymed verse version of Othello, which he claimed the authorship. He didn't write it, but it was his in the same way that singers now have their signature songs. Also, he was in the same circus at the same time, rather at different times in the same show. He would do whiteface clowning and blackface clowning. Minstrelsy, white men blacking up as black men, were a standard part of the antebellum, the pre-Civil War amusements. Dan Rice would do that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, the first thing we have in his handwriting is a letter to Stephen Foster's brother, where he says, I'm making $25 a week, which was probably a lie, in blackface and whiteface clowning. The other thing that really helped propel Rice to fame was an incredible talent. His words came like a waterfall. They were, well, let's mix metaphors all over the place. Like a waterfall, sparking off everything, bouncing off the walls. His words were like a kaleidoscope. Think Robin Williams. If you ever see Robin Williams in concert, he will talk in a space of maybe 3 minutes about 10 different subjects. You never notice when he's shifting, and you're laughing the whole time. That's Dan Rice. Dan Rice also physically was stocky and powerful like Robin Williams. I mentioned Robin Williams because he was the one I had in mind as I was writing. That's my model of Uncle Sam, rather of Dan Rice. Rice was also famous because he had incredible animal acts. Now, he had a waltzing camel. Again, don't want to give away too many trade secrets. Waltzing camel meant that the band would play a waltz while the trainer would walk the camel around the ring. And if they changed the music to a gavotte, then it was a camel that could dance to the gavotte. And they would do it in time to the animal, but there would be those reviews talking about these wonderfully musical animals who could dance in time to the music. He had comic mules. He had a rhino, reputed to be the first trained rhino in 2,000 years. I haven't found anything to the contrary. There's a great rhino guy. I think that's his specialty. He's a lawyer in Atlanta, and he just specializes in rhinoceroses. They weren't called rhinos at the time, by the way. Rhino at the time was slang for money. But I don't think a rhino could do much. Probably a lot less than a pig, but it was trained. And he had Lalla Rookh, his tightrope walking elephant. Now, I'll let you in on a little secret. This is a big controversy in the animal training world because, well, rather, I'm going to make it a controversy. The animal trainers I know, I used to be with Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, so I've got a few contacts. The animal trainers I know say it can't be done. Fred Dollinger at Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin, was originally an engineer and is now the curator, and he says it can't be done because physically, day after day, in a summer tent, you couldn't set up that rigging and then get an animal an elephant walking on that. I mean, it just couldn't be done. So between the elephant trainers and the engineers, they say it couldn't be done. In my book, I say it happened, and I'll tell you why. Dan Rice was immensely popular. Partly because of that popularity, he was also regularly criticized. There was a whole fight going on about the issue of popularity. Some people criticized him because he was popular and talking about politics in the ring. So, over the years that he had Lala Rook, in all of the criticisms directed at him, and there were some Jim Dandies, not one word suggested that this didn't happen. Nobody said the tightrope walking elephant is a humbug. That's evidence as far as I'm concerned. I may have to duke it out with Buckles Woodcock, famous elephant trainer, because he said it can't be done. But nobody complained about it. Nobody. And they complained about everything else. They said the showgirls are ugly. They said Dan Rice has no wit and he's vulgar besides. They said the rhino is a humbug. It just sits there, which it probably did. But nobody ever said, in anything I could find, that the elephant didn't walk the tightrope. So, those are the sides. I did point counterpoint with you, and you can decide what you want. Now, Dan Rice was also famous because he was king of the circus at a time when circus was deeply embedded in American life. I alluded to that earlier. But, okay, now when we think of the good old days of the circus, you can conjure the image of what the summer circus was like in the 1850s. That is, you're in a rural town, you've had maybe 2 visitors in the past 6 months. The only color in your life is the green on the trees and a few wildflowers and some berries, because the houses are brown, the ground is brown, your faces are brown, your clothes are brown, it's dull and drab, and it's a hard life. Now, the circus comes to town with red and yellow and blue and green and colors, with all those colors, with lights. I mean, at night, you go out to your shed with the candle or maybe an oil lamp if you can afford it. The circus comes, and you've got a big spoke with 100 candles on it, all lit. So you got light in the middle of the night. You also have, let me see, do I have this set up right? Girls and boys. You've got men and women showing off their legs, and the whole culture was aware of it. Now, you often didn't talk about it directly, but everybody knew. When you went to the circus, you were going to get to see what they had. Men's legs and women's legs. As a matter of fact, now this picture is from a book, a sensationalist book, from about 30 years later, the 1880s. There's another picture called Playing Circus. Playing circus on down the road became slang for obscene games with prostitutes. But for now, it was legs and bodies, torsos, tight clothes that you just didn't see in Ma Perkins at church. Now, so you had that summer excitement, and you had all of this, and the clown. On the other hand, the circus, as I say, was deeply embedded in American life. It was only in the summer that you toured with those tents out in the boondocks. In the winter, the stars went to the cities. It was urban sophistication. It was a feature of cities. So you would have circuses competing with theaters, competing in theaters themselves. This particular one, Dan Rice's amphitheater, built for him in New Orleans, one of the major cities of the time. It later became the Academy of Music, which through the late 19th century was the jewel of New Orleans theaters. It was built originally for Rice to come and do a circus in the winter. You had the same thing at the Baltimore Front Street. You had it in New York theaters, Boston theaters, Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, though they were slightly smaller. You had it at the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia, which I mention for two reasons especially, because the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia is still standing and still presenting performances, and because when I was an actor, I performed there too. Dan and I played the same house. So you had urban sophistication, you had that excitement in the summers, and you had sex and violence, which are kind of those representatives for life and death, kind of our symbols on why we choose to look at the more interesting parts, sex and violence. But that's what's behind it. Now, so here's the implication of sex. By the way, it's not just that you could see. There was also the suggestion that you could get easy sex, that these were people with loose morals, men and women. Maybe it's true. I heard it about the circus when I was on the circus. Not me. So you had the sex, but you also had the violence. Now, when a circus came to town in the old days, that is the old days, say 1848, 1852, 1856, and you rolled into a little town in Illinois or Iowa or upstate New York, for the fighters in town, it's fresh meat. It's somebody new to fight. A circus had to be an efficient fighting unit because almost every town you're going to get in a fight. As a matter of fact, you pretty much had to hire your hands to be good fighters. Dan Rice wrote a diary. I found a diary of his from 1856 when he was touring Massachusetts. He noted when there weren't fights in Salem and Lynn, Massachusetts. Fighting was so common. Hudson River towns. College towns were special fighting towns. Circus history particularly mentioned Princeton, Yale, and Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan, my alma mater. I suppose college boys wanted to prove that they were as tough as anybody. Mining towns and river towns. The Hudson River, lots of fights, lots of fights. As a matter of fact, one got Rice in a lot of trouble up in Troy, New York, which I mentioned because the one circus fight I got in when I was on the circus was in Troy, New York. And I was the only one who came out with any injuries, which shows you that don't fight unless you're good at it. I'm not. I didn't intend to. I just sort of wanted to watch, but but it was more, so Rice's fame was more than his talent, and it was more than circus's central place in American culture. Rice insinuated himself into the deepest feelings of American life. It was a very volatile time. There were bankruptcies galore as capitalism started to take hold in the United States, as industrialism started to take hold, and you had industrial towns. You had that kind of increasing regimentation. There were bankruptcies, there were failures. I mean, you can say what you want about the free market, but without any protections at all, lots of people fail. Dan Rice failed all the time. He was a kind of symbol that you could fail and come back again because he kept doing it. He feuded all the time. He was usually in a fight himself. I say in my book that if he had not been in circus history for being a great clown, he would have been in circus history for being probably one of the best fighters of American circus. He got into it all the time, and he got in feuds. former owners, former employers. There was one famous fight he had up and down the Mississippi. So it spoke to the anxiety of American people. The brave front, we can do whatever we want, hid to a certain extent that worry that was behind it. And it was lurking all the time. You could never tell. I mean, remember, the more prominent history, Ulysses S. Grant was a failure most of his life. Abraham Lincoln went into debt. That was part of the American history. That was part of the American story. Dan Rice was there, and Dan Rice was there saying, I can survive. He named one of his circuses the Phoenix Circus. I can rise from the ashes. There was also, now this is, need to warm up for this. Okay, hang tight for this. The middle class was forming. That is, in earlier days, you really didn't have what we now consider middle managers, white collar. You had manual laborers and you had the elite. The founding fathers were an elite. The owners, that kind of thing. As the 19th century developed, you had people who were in between. Well, the in between is always a difficult place to be. So as the middle class formed, it wasn't quite sure what it was. Partly because the United States doesn't really acknowledge that there are classes. So it could distinguish itself from the elite by saying, well, we've got more common sense than they do. You know, I got more common sense in my little finger than, you know, name your elite. Or they may be rich, but they're not happy. Okay? Or they may be smart, but do they really know anything about life? Okay? So we can dismiss the elite fairly easily. But what about those who are doing what we used to do? Day labor. You can't say they're lower class. That's rude. So the middle class developed a way to kind of identify itself, a kind of mutual identification and admiration society that pushed itself away from a place it wasn't that far removed. Remember, if you failed, you're a day laborer again. So what it did was develop strategies that we're still using. For instance, which fork to use? Movies still do that with the innocent character. You either show somebody is not very smart by not being aware of sophistication, but more often it's an innocent, a childlike figure, like Tom Hanks in the movie Big, where he goes to the fancy schmancy cocktail party, and he's a child who's grown to a man's body, so he's our innocent. We identify with him, and he doesn't know what to do, so somehow we're watching the movie, and what he does is exactly right. Now, so the middle class was doing that with the proper way to greet people, the proper clothes to wear and when, how to behave at performances. For instance, the idea that we applaud at the end of a symphony rather than between movements. Is there anything inherent about that? Anything natural? There was a critic in Boston in the 1880s who said, with German ideas, said, it's a whole piece of art and you must wait to the end to applaud. So in jazz now, when they do the solo, we applaud. But if we really like what they did after the first movement, we sit quietly because we know our role. The middle class was learning to be quiet. And the motto, the thing that really clinched it for everybody was aspiration. We aspire to something higher. What does that mean? They didn't know, neither do we. It was just a way to signal, I'm with you. We all aspire to something higher. Higher than what? Than those other people. Who are those other people? Well, it would be kind of rude to name them, but they're not our kind of people. I mean, there are all kinds of language. Now, I seem to be coming far afield from Dan Rice, except, let me get back to Rice. Rice was the head of this cultural parade. Everything about his circus he denominated as an aspirational thing. He, too, would take the crude, vulgar jokes of the clown and improve them, refine them. He, too, would take a vulgar circus and refine it and make it aspirational. So, you had, his wasn't a circus, but Dan Rice's great show. Circus dropped out of his advertisements. Clown dropped out of his advertisements. He was the great American humorist. Let me see if I've got his horse, Excelsior. Okay, we're in New York. What's the New York State motto? Excelsior. What does Excelsior mean? Higher. Longfellow's famous poem, Excelsior. I learned it first through Rocky and Bullwinkle on TV. That was the cartoon of Rocky and Bullwinkle and the guy climbing the mountain. He knows not why he climbs, but he climbs. Excelsior, the strange device he carries. Longfellow wrote a poem explaining what the poem meant. And what he explained was his hero aspires to something higher. What? Higher. Just something higher. So, here you had the animal that was named something higher. Its entrance into the arena was on the shoulders of the workers of the circus, but Rice usually advertised it as gentlemen of the town. And it also had an act, the horse did, where it would climb stairs. Now, probably not that high in this picture. They took liberties. But it literally climbed to something higher. It was Excelsior. And of course, at the core of aspiration was the hearth, the wife, the mother, teaching values to the children. Now that would have been news to the 18th century, because women historically have been Eve, the one who offers temptation. The 19th century took some ideas from other sources and decided that that did glorify women. The Virgin Mary as a prominent example, but taking it out of its religious context, the middle class in the 19th century brought it into the home and said, okay, the man will go out and fight for the daily bread and go as close to the line as he can without necessarily cheating, without necessarily lying. On the other hand, like the movie Godfather, we won't talk about some of those things we do. The wife will not know about that. Why? Because she's at home with the children, protecting the sanctity of the American family. The wife is presumed now to be, the mother especially, is presumed to be more noble, more moral than the man. Because the man is out there in that battle for survival. So this is Maggie, Dan Rice's first wife. He married strong women. She, I'm not sure if I can do this right. This was after they divorced. She went out with Mrs. Dan Rice's Great Show. At one point he sued because she was using Dan Rice's Great Show, so she had to stop using that. So this was an ad from 1863 after they divorced. So that's Maggie. And she was, and the advertisement that said he wasn't a clown, but great American humorist, now started to talk about her as the moral center of the circus. And she performed, because to display yourself in public is kind of rude. If you're really a shy, modest person, woman, then you're at home. You're not out on the streets displaying yourself, much less in a circus ring. So why was she in a circus ring? To educate the apprentices, so she had an intellectual function, and she was educating the women of society who would come to watch in healthful exercise, so that they would have the rosy glow on their cheek without the use of makeup. Painted women used makeup, but if you had good exercise as a woman, you got proper exercise. So she was instructing the women of America. That's why she was in the circus. That's why she was performing. And Dan Rice himself, not only the great American humorist, but a gentleman jester, a public figure. This bust was done by the same man who did the bust of Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was the person Dan Rice supported in his races against Abraham Lincoln in 1858 for Senate and in 1860 for president. So Dan Rice was famous because of his talent, his great comic genius, because of how deeply embedded circus was, and performance generally was, in American life, and because he fit this growing tide of how the middle class wanted to see itself. So, why did he fall from fame? Well, the usual story of a fall from fame of the merely popular is that they're popular and inherently shallow, so of course they're going to fall from fame. Whatever happened to stories come up all the time. I mean, has Britney Spears overtaken Madonna? I don't know. But if she has, then there'll be those, oh, Madonna, oh, yes, she was popular for a while, but then she faded. And then Britney Spears, oh, she'll fade. And we expect that of popularity. Dan Rice's is a more interesting and more complex story. And there are two overlapping reasons he fell from fame. The first was his Civil War politics. He went into the Civil War, those years leading up to the Civil War that started in 1861, arguing about the fanatics who were trying to destroy the country. In later years, he and his apologists would suggest that the fanatics trying to destroy the country were the Southerners who were trying to secede. That's not who he was talking about. He was talking about the abolitionists. They were, in retrospect, we have come to honor them as well we should. I can't think of a reform more necessary for the United States than abolition. I mean, that's America's great sin with slavery. On the other hand, the Constitution allowed slavery. It acknowledged it and allowed it. So, when the abolitionists said, our country is rotten and deserves to be destroyed, if the South wants to go, let them, most of the country thought they were crackpots. They would have Constitution burning parties. The way people now are up in arms about flag burning, they would burn the Constitution and say this is a rotten document. So, going into the Civil War, Rice was in effect taking the Democratic position. There were problems with that, especially as the war started to turn. And as Abraham Lincoln, one of my heroes, transformed what had been simply a civil war into a fight for freedom. Abraham Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, and I'm taking this from a wonderful book by Gary Wills, a wonderful argument. 7 years ago in the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago back, wasn't the Constitution, it was the Declaration of Independence. That was a political document. When Abraham Lincoln stood up in Gettysburg and said, 7 years ago, he was saying, our country was founded by the people, of the people, by the people, for the people, how he ended the Gettysburg Address. He was saying that the people formed the United States, and that the Constitution is a discussion of that, a second draft. So it was the people who formed it, and states can't leave. And if this fight is about anything, if this carnage is about anything, it's about not just keeping the country together, but a new birth of freedom. All men, and as we've learned since, all people are created equal. The Democrats, including Rice, going around the country, arguing in the circus ring, running for the state senate in Pennsylvania, was saying, of the states, by the states, for the states. That was the peace Democrat position. So he was arguing against Lincoln, against the Republicans, and especially against the abolitionists. It didn't work. He was wrong. The Democrats were wrong. The South was wrong. They were talking about original intent the way we're talking about original intent now, but slavery was wrong. Lincoln had the genius to know that, and in legal ways, work the country around and lead the country where it didn't even know it wanted to go. If you had said in 1861, yeah, we're going to go fight at Bull Run, and it's to free the slaves, the North would have said no. Most of those soldiers would have left the field. They had to work their way through it, led step by patient step by Lincoln. Rice was resisting. And Rice had the law behind it. The Constitution said slavery is all right. So, he had a lot of trouble with that. After his divorce from Maggie, he, in effect, got a trophy wife. This is Rebecca. She was the young daughter of the local society in Girard, Pennsylvania, where he had set up winter quarters. They didn't like much marrying the flower of their aristocracy to Dan Rice. But this is her with Excelsior Jr. The original Excelsior had died. This was another white horse, blind, did the same tricks. So that's Rebecca, and there were comments when he married saying, well, he's trying to get himself right on the union question by forming a union with his new wife. By the way, lest you think too badly of Dan for taking a trophy wife, Maggie took a trophy husband. She married their young treasurer, and actually his name's up here somewhere, but she was in charge. So, through the Civil War and out of the Civil War, Dan Rice developed a few strategies to distance himself from what had been Southern sympathies. In 1865, he commissioned and paid for what was said to be the first monument to the Civil War dead in Girard, Pennsylvania, his hometown. Again, some of the locals didn't like it, the aristocracy of the small town. So they tried to halt him from doing this, particularly because that's his house back there. He put it in a square right in front of his house. They thought that was a little showy. But it became a national event. It made the front cover of Harper's Weekly, national journal. Reporters came from Cleveland, from New York, from Philadelphia. Thousands came. And, of course, he made hay while the sun shone. He had 3 shows that day instead of his usual 2. So he paid for the monument. He started to create fictions. Now, the biggest one is probably one of the most important ones to know about, that he was best friends with Abraham Lincoln. If you've ever read anything about Dan Rice, because there's a little bit out there, and tell my book, what you read is that Dan Rice was best friends with Abraham Lincoln. He'd come to the White House and tell him the mood of the country. They'd swap dirty jokes. They'd talk about the old days on the Western Plains. Not Lincoln historians have found, and their name is legion. They've found nothing. There's a book, Lincoln Day by Day. There's nothing about Dan Rice. There's nothing in primary documentation of Dan Rice visiting Lincoln. One biographer of Rice said that he went to visit Lincoln when he played Washington, and he played Washington during the Civil War. He said Rice went to visit Lincoln, but the newspapers didn't report it because of the gravity of the Civil War. They reported the battles, but they didn't report this alleged visit. But more importantly than that, not more importantly, but equally with that lack of evidence, is the fact that he was a political opponent. He was traveling the country saying, Lincoln is destroying the country. Now, Lincoln had an expansive heart. He had a huge soul. He could stand with people who attacked him all the time because he had his eye on a greater goal. So he might have met Dan Rice. He might have stood there next to him, but no evidence of it, and they were political opponents. Definitely not best friends, which is a shame because it's a great story, particularly if you're in circus. You love that one. As a matter of fact, that's how I got interested in the first place. I was out of the circus myself. I had left the circus. I was an actor in New York City. A friend of mine, we were backstage. We were touring city parks and some time on our hands, and he told me about this circus clown who'd been best friends with Abraham Lincoln. And I thought, I was a circus clown. I think Abraham Lincoln is a great guy. This sounds cool. And by the time I found out it was wrong, I was hooked. So I said there were 2 overlapping reasons Rice fell from fame. First, his Civil War politics. Now, he told these stories that kept getting him away from what had been his actual beliefs. But enough of the people knew where he had been that they could dismiss it, they could ignore it, but they wouldn't forget it. That he was starting to become simply a politician evading what had been his earlier stand. That makes for tenuous popularity. But there was another reason. And if you could divorce one or these other reasons, I don't know what would have happened to Rice. I mean, it's possible, doing the what-if game. Ballet had been considered a vulgar form because that was nothing but women showing off their legs. So, I mean, the circus at least had other things going on, but ballet girls, basically, if you were to say a stripper now, that was what ballet girls were considered. Well, ballet somehow, as this hierarchy of performance forms developed. Some became considered high. Symphony, Shakespeare, ballet. Now, my personal opinion has nothing to do with the book, is that there are no words in ballet, there are no words in symphony, so you can put out whatever meaning you want on it. I'll just throw that one in for free. But Dan Rice was saying, mine is an elevated form too. So perhaps without the Civil War and this other reason I'm about to talk about, he might have pushed his up as well. It's a what-if game. But there was this double whammy, these two reasons. His Civil War opinions, and the other one was culture was changing. Now, Dan Rice rode that wave as the middle class was forming, and it said, we want more elevated forms. We want to aspire to something higher, and we want the things we go see to aspire to something higher as well. Well, Dan Rice filled that bill. But there was another wave coming that billowed out of the first one, and that was, if you have some things high, some things have to be low. Notice how often when you're talking with your friends, when you're reading the paper, and it talks about something that's artistic, notice how often it contrasts it to something else that's not. Well, this isn't mere entertainment. How often have you heard that? It's embedded in the way we now think about performance, and that was forming in the 19th century. So, Dan Rice wanted to go up. Lots of people thought he was going up. But you need something low. Well, what fills the low bill better than the circus, where you got women showing off their legs, where you've got animals with all of their sweat and grunts and defecation right there in front of you. You've got clowns, some of them with vulgar jokes. So audiences were starting to look at that way. Also, another key change. In the 1840s and 1850s, audiences at performances and politics were participatory. They considered themselves patrons of the event. You didn't go to the theater in 1840, 1845 to sit there in quiet, in the dark, and appreciate the art in front of you. You went up there to get involved. If you liked a monologue, you'd yell so they'd repeat the monologue, and they would. In circus, if Dan Rice was talking about politics, people were talking back. Well, audiences were learning new behavior. What an audience does is sit quietly and watch the art framed like a picture at a museum. So technology helped that, because with the original technology, those candles up there, everybody's equally lit. You went to the theater to be seen as much as anything. You'd sit there, you'd roam around the theater, you'd talk to the actors, you'd talk to the clowns. Well, lights went down, and audiences, we all learned our place, which was to sit quietly and observe. Dan Rice's strength had been in that robust interaction with him right there on the ramparts, as it were. Right there to the people with them talking back. That simply doesn't work with this new quiet decorum. Now, we can talk about all the 20th century manifestations where they've tried to recreate that excitement in various ways. Audience participation, theater in the round, various forms. But they're all working off the basic model that the best way to do it is a quiet audience. That was a model that was being formed partly by Dan Rice. Ironically, he was hoist on his own petard. He was wrecked by the things he had helped put in motion. So, he became a drunk. He became a bankrupt for good, almost for good. Girard, Pennsylvania, where he had set up his winter quarters, wanted nothing to do with him. He divorced, or rather his wife divorced him. But then he pulled himself up. He was nothing if not resilient. And he went on a lecture tour of Texas in the 1880s. And while he was there, he met, I think, my favorite of his three wives. Marcella Greathouse Robinson de Goffredo Rice. She was married a bunch of times. Her father had been one of the early cowboy pioneers forming the cattle ranches. Her husband, Captain Greathouse, had been one of the first to take cattle up to Dodge City. He died on the trail. She became rich in land and cattle. It's not clear how rich she was in money. Then she married a couple others. One who ran off with her money. She got it back and divorced him. A dentist who was kind of weakling, and he died, and his family blamed her. She would ride around San Antonio in her buggy. She tried to elbow her way into the all-male Livestock Association of San Antonio. Well, you got two spirited people. They met and they married. Her family didn't like it at all. But they got married. That's Marcella. And then he did a lecture tour. He sold snake oil, Joe He's magic medicine that's good for what ails you. You can take it orally or apply it topically. It cures blindness. It cures dropsy. It cures almost anything. And then the last attempt for Rice. The circus was changing. It had been relegated to low, so the circus became what we think of it now, this kind of marginal form for the kiddies. And a clown is good for the kids. Very few people now go to the circus, adults, go to the circus, genuinely expecting to laugh. That was one of the things I found when I was a clown. So if I ever did something that was really funny, I could tell by the surprise on their faces. That was my favorite reaction, actually. I would be doing something with the kids, because people bring their kids. I'd be doing something with the kids, and then I could see out of the corner of my eye this light dawning in their eye, because it'd been glazed over. Oh, it's cute. They're with the kids. Oh, the clown's with the kids. That's fine. That's fine. And then I'd see, oh, what'd he say? Oh. So Dan Rice tried to latch on to this nostalgia, this sentimentality about circus. So he came back as Old Uncle Dan. Not quite coincidentally, the Santa Claus figure was growing through this same period from a lean kind of treat or coal-giving kind of guy into the roly-poly figure we think of now. Good old Santa, good old Uncle Rice. P.T. Barnum competed with Dan Rice, probably one of the biggest humbugs the United States has known. By the end of his career, he was old Phineas who just loved children. He kept posing with kids around him. He was just old Uncle Phineas, as sweet and as innocent as you could like. John D. Rockefeller, one of our robber barons, the end of his life. Kids around him, yeah, he just loved those little kids. Dan Rice tried to do the same thing. Dan Rice, old-time circus songster. And then, but he became virtually unknown. His first circus was 1843. In 1891, he tried again here in New York. Tent blew down, which often happened. He got sick. The circus died. His circus died. By then, they were all big ones anyway. He went to live with his mother's people down in West Long Branch, New Jersey. And Maggie, his first wife, came back to nurse him. And then he died, 1900, headed into not only a completely new century, but the circus totally changed. And now that by the 1880s, we would recognize the circus. It is still mostly what it was then. And the ones that try to be different, Cirque du Soleil, Big Apple Circus, are still often working off that model. Consider, when you read about one of the other new circuses, notice how often they say something like, but we're not Ringling. Sometimes by name and sometimes saying, we're not one of those big extravaganzas. Well, Ringling's the big extravaganza now in circuses. There are other circuses out there, three-ring circuses, but Ringling's the big one. So if they say we're not those big extravaganzas, what they're saying is, well, we're circus. We're sort of like them. We do the same kinds of stuff, but we're not them. We got better lighting in the case of Cirque du Soleil. Big Apple, we're small and intimate. My own wife says she likes that one ring better because you can focus better. Should have had some kind of discussion about that before we got married. So, that's Dan Rice. Let me see. Oh, I brought these up here. You'd seen the slide of that one, on Uncle Dan, or rather, Uncle Sam Dan. This is a poster, unoriginal, from 1858. Doesn't say circus anywhere on this. doesn't say clown. It's Dan Rice who will be talking about events of the day, and I made a little bit of this in the book. It's circus acts, and then it's also a huge spectacle with the volcano, with the appearance of flowing lava. There's flowing water on stage. There's fire on stage. Now remember, this isn't computer-generated stuff in fire safety theaters. These are old wooden theaters. This one is in New York City. Oh, fiddlesticks. I forget where it was. Oh, no. Oh, no. It's at the National Theater on Walnut Street in Philadelphia. And the name of this particular spectacle is the Magic Ring. Now, I'm no Wagnerian. On the other hand, Wagner was writing his Magic Ring about this time, and Dan Rice had the same Magic Ring and the search and the trolls in the mountain and the princess. Well, I don't know if Wagner had a princess, but the heroine and a Siegfried kind of character. That was all on stage. That was what people went to the circus to see. So, oh, I'm sorry, I said 1858, 1860. I'm a historian, you know. Right now, 1858 or 1860 doesn't matter a whole lot to you, but I know the difference. So that was 1860. So, I am now open for any questions about anything. Ballet, George Balanchine, whatever.
You ever go to the law?
We've
Yes,
got...
oops. Well, that's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask whatever happened with his law degree.
all of this about Dan Rice, and you want to know about my law degree. Well, yeah, my mother, somebody said in the audience. I graduated from Boalt Hall, the University of California, Berkeley, in 1976. While I was waiting to take the bar exam, I applied to Clown College, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus Clown College. I took the bar exam. Then, while I was waiting to hear if I had passed, I found out I'd gotten into the Clown College. So I went to the Clown College, which was a 10-week program. You don't learn to be a clown in 10 weeks. You need an audience. And I'll get back to the law school, I promise you. When I first started writing, I thought I had nothing in common with Dan Rice. The circus was so totally different. He was a star. I was not a star. I was one of the cavorting masses. He was a talking clown, and though I talked a lot when I went up in the seats, officially I was down in the rings and doing pantomime kinds of things. I was just physical stuff. So I thought there were huge differences. But I began to realize as I worked on it that Rice's strength was that interaction with the audience. And the thing I learned in the circus, especially when I went up into the seats, was interaction. There are clowns who like to clown, in effect, behind a proscenium. That is, they like the idea that there is this gap. I like to go up there, climbing on the seats. Literally, climbing on the seats. And I realized that the struggles I went through were similar to the struggles Dan Rice went through. Now, I'm not trying to compare us. He was infinitely greater than I was. But we took the same path. So, back to law school. I promised I'd get back to it. So, I went to clown school, and a lot of people out of law school, they, you know, go cruise the South Pacific, or they go backpacking in Europe, or they do something for a while to take a break before they go off and become lawyers. And I figured that's what clown school would be. But then my father surprised me at the graduation. Now, I didn't go to my own college graduation, neither did my family. And this is the hippy-dippy 60s, and and I was out in California for my law school graduation, so they hadn't come to that. Long ways away, and it wasn't that big a deal. My sister lived out there, she came, but that's it. But clown school, my father surprised me, flew down that night. Now, the Clown College graduation was. Clown school is now defunct. The Ringling has stopped sponsoring it. But it is a 3.5, 4-hour performance. That's also a graduation ceremony. That's also an audition for the circus. Lots of pressure. But while everybody else was worrying, oh, I hope I get a contract. Oh, I've wanted to, forever, I've wanted to be a clown. I was going, oh, what should I do if I get a contract? My father came down and I said, in effect, you know, I really should go back to the law. And he said, why? And, you know, sometimes it's just that little thing, you go, oh, yeah, why? But I figured I would do it for 1 year. But then at the end of the 1 year, Ringling has a 2-year tour in effect. They go to some cities 1 year, and then that unit goes to other cities, while the second unit goes to the ones the first one went to the year before. They alternate. So I figured at the end of my first year, well, I'll get the full 2 years. Okay, because hadn't been to the West Coast yet. Fine. I hadn't played Madison Square Garden yet. So I'd stay 2 years. And then they asked me to stay for a third year to become their advanced clown ambassador. I had business cards and everything. I preceded the circus by a week to do whatever publicity they had. I've got the key to the city of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I did a birthday, I did a 4th of July picnic with the governor of Texas. I performed at minor league baseball games, at North Carolina state basketball game, pro wrestling at the Atlanta Omni. My toughest one, one of my toughest ones, hockey at the Boston Gardens. They don't want to see a clown. But I survived. Hospital visits, talks, school visits, seminars at colleges, my key to the city of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So I did that for a third year. And then I thought, okay, probably time to go back to law. That's what you want to know, wasn't it? I didn't. Came to New York to be an actor. Some people you just can't make anything out of.
Are you still acting here in New York?
No, I was an actor in New York, primarily Shakespeare. I discovered that the acting lessons of a clown, I'll use some actor jargon here, being in the moment, really dealing with what happens rather than memorizing your lines and doing whatever you're going to do, but really reacting off of what people are doing and saying. Those are good acting lessons. I learned that as a clown. It helped me a lot with, I did some contemporary stuff, a few musicals, which was probably a mistake by the casting director. I love musicals, but my voice, I love musicals. I met my wife at an audition. She's got a great voice. But then she went back to school, got her degree. We decided we've had enough of New York and trying to make a living for now. Her with her startup musicals, me with my Shakespeare. Shakespeare doesn't pay a lot, though it's great fun. I love doing Shakespeare. So I went to Northwestern to get my PhD. We had kids. I taught at the University of Michigan Flint, and then we decided, you know, New York is really where we should be. So we came back, and here I am hoping to talk about Dan Rice.
Are you acting here now?
No. Oh, that was your question. Am I acting here now? No. No, I'm not. I did, after I got back, sure that acting was behind me, get offered a part, The Actor's Dream. A producer called me out of the blue and said, do you want to play Rip Van Winkle? I said, sure. That's a tough one to pass up. So, but no, not acting. I'm writing this book and now trying to decide what I'm going to do next. Maybe med school. Law. No, I've done that. I was the first. My claim to fame as a lawyer, as sort of lawyer. While I was a student, I was an intern at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia, and they had recently changed their rules of practice. So I was told. I'm not going to fight anybody about this. I was told I was the first student, that is non-lawyer, to represent the Eastern District of Pennsylvania in federal court, and I won too. Yes, another question.
Yeah, what got Mr. Rice started in show business?
What got Dan started in show business?
No law school, I see.
No law school. No law school. He claimed his father had been a law clerk of Aaron Burr, but he claimed lots of things. I mentioned that dancing and singing in the stables, that it was a dancing, singing country, a dancing, singing, fighting country. He worked in the stables. was good with horses, drove wagons, probably some pickup horse races. And in the stables, you danced and sang. You'd go to the theater, and the next day, like teenage kids in the 50s and 60s, you'd watch Soul Train American Bandstand and go home and practice. They'd come to the stables, and they'd do whatever dances they saw. They'd sing the songs they heard. And he discovered he had a talent for it. And he had a strong ambition, so he knew he wanted to do more. So when he had a chance to go out with the learned pig, remember the learned pig? He grabbed it. There is a suggestion that he didn't even get paid, that it was just room and keep, and maybe not even room, but a chance to get a foot in. And I suspect that was it, his ambition and his talent. Yes, ma'am. We got a microphone.
During the Civil War, I know you mentioned his politics. To what extent was there also the circuses going out and doing their thing during the wartime?
Mostly the circuses did what you'd expect of performance now. If they were traveling in the North because the South was cut off. The South was a great place for touring circuses. Well, that was obviously cut off during the North. So lots of circuses in the Northeast bumping up against each other. A lot went up into Canada. Some went on international tours. They went to South America. They went to the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii. And for the most part, they waved the flag. Waved the flag ardently and fervently and wrap themselves in the flag. I've got another illustration in my book where Dan Rice is dressed in this style of outfit, only it's blue up here with stars and red and white stripes all the way down. He literally, and in one case, he literally wrapped himself in the flag because there was some booze in Philadelphia because of his Southern sympathies. So for the most part, very pro-North, pro-Union, especially as the war started to turn in the late 1864, 1865, as it started to turn toward the North. But, I mean, there were still strong pockets of democratic feeling. I mean, New York City had draft riots. Those folks said, this isn't our fight. We're not going to go fight. And they had rioting about it. You could probably do a circus in New York and at the time and have said, I'm not so sure if this war is a good thing, or words to that effect. But for all of the other talking clowns, few were as political as Rice, and none were as ardently political as Rice. So he was an exception in many ways. Yes, you had your hand up?
A tiny question and a little comment.
Okay.
What did you get your PhD in?
Theater, history, and drama. It was on Dan Rice.
Now here's my comment. I remember many years ago, Alan Alda was asked, how did you decide what to do? And he said, I couldn't decide what I wanted to be, so I decided to be an actor. I could do everything. So,
Yep.
an
actor, you play lots of parts. Actually, the part of the appeal of being a lawyer is that there is the possibility that you can be a specialist in lots of different things, because whatever case you're working on, you become an asbestos specialist in the science of computer technology, in human relations. I mean, there is that prospect, and I think that's part of what appealed to me. I loved law school. Actually, that may have been my first clue. I wasn't fit to be a lawyer, because most of my classmates in law school, I will not generalize to all other law schools and all other lawyers, but my classmates, for the most part, didn't like law school. They wanted to get out there and be doing it. And I loved law school. I thought it was great fun. Any other questions?
How about entertainment law?
Entertainment law? It's certainly a possibility. As a matter of fact, there was a friend of mine on the circus my first year who is now who was also a clown, who is now an agent in L.A., or manager in L.A. But to do entertainment law, I think you want to have to practice law. And I haven't quite found that yet.
What do you think you will be doing now?
What will I be doing now? Oh, I don't know. A few movie companies have asked to look at my book. Now, that doesn't, as a practical matter, mean anything because movie companies are always looking for things. I assume I've got this vision of the office of a movie executive. There's the desk, and there's, I don't know, whatever fancy gewgaws they've got. And over here are a storehouse full of all the projects they're considering. So, you know, my book is somewhere, you know, 6th row from the back, 6 down, 10 over. On the other hand, if something happens, gosh, maybe I could be a consultant. I don't know. Maybe write another book. Maybe direct. I love to direct.
Yeah, how old a guy are you now?
How old am I? $39.
You deserve that.
She hit him. She did. She hit him. Yes, sir.
I think of humorists, Mark Twain or
Mark
Will
Twain.
Rogers or something. And everybody who talks about them has some quotes from them. Are there quotes from Dan Rice?
Quotes from Dan Rice. You have hit one of the central difficulties with the book. Dan Rice, from all reports, was amazingly funny. You would be laughing throughout his performance. The thing about comedy, though, is that it is immediate. Mark Twain, you have quotes because he was a writer. Now, he became a performer, but his stuff was meant to be read. Will Rogers wrote a newspaper column. We know his quotations from that. There are a few things, but only moderately music. I mean, there's the lo and behold style he talked about of women's clothes. But the political stuff, which was probably the juiciest stuff, didn't get written down. He joked once about having to rush back to the hotel with his wife's, he bought a hat for his wife and he had to rush back. And the ringmaster said, why? So I could get there before the fashion changed. But it wasn't that. I mean, if we think now of, a lot of people like the Seinfeld show. A lot of people laughed at the Seinfeld show. But if you say Seinfeld, then you think, oh, yeah, I know that. So if you say one of the lines, you fill in the gaps. Or Robin Williams, one of my favorite. I mentioned him again. I saw him live just a few weeks ago. He said, and I was rolling on the floor when he said it, can you believe that? It was funny at the time. So when you say you had to be there, that's not just an excuse for a bad joke. It's a reminder that comedy really is immediate. Dan Rice was hilarious. Everybody agreed. His enemies even agreed. They just didn't like what he was making jokes about. But no great lines. It's a cloud. It's smoke. It's evanescent, and it's gone. So, do we have time for one more, or one more question? The microphone. One more question. Pressure's on. It's got to be a good one.
You mentioned that wife number 1 came back to care for him.
Yes.
What happened to wife number 3?
That's kind of a mystery. I've got more about Marcella than any of the others because she wrote letters back to Texas and saying, we are deeply in love. I wish you could come and see what a great guy he is. Because she knew they didn't think much of the marriage either. But then she was gone. She went back to Texas, maybe for her arthritis, a drier climate. Nothing in his papers. However, when she died about 15 years later, she listed herself as Marcella Rice McLaren. Oh, McLaren was his original name, to make it a good story, as Marcella Rice. So as far as she was concerned, she was still married to him, and she had 4 other choices she could have picked. So, thank you very much. Great question.
David Carlian spent 3 years in the circus as a clown and is author of Dan Rice, the most famous man you've never heard of. It's published by Public Affairs. Their website is publicaffairsbooks.com.